Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for the ears of the public. For centuries, America has prided itself on stories of freedom, of democracy, of destiny written across open land. But buried beneath that narrative, hidden under mountains of denial, lies a truth that even now makes governments uneasy. It is not written in textbooks, it is not taught in classrooms. It lives in something far older, far more dangerous: blood. The Cherokee, a people known for resilience, survival, and memory older than the Republic itself, carry within their veins a signature that does not belong, a genetic whisper that should not exist. For decades, scientists have stumbled across anomalies in Cherokee DNA, patterns that trace to origins not accounted for in official history, markers that stretch beyond the tidy lines of migration theory and colonial storytelling. Instead of being explained, these findings were quietly filed away, dismissed, or buried under the polite silence of academia. Because if they are true, if the blood of the Cherokee holds what the records deny, then America itself is built on a lie so large it would split the story of this nation down its center. Picture the Appalachian ridges before highways carved through them, mist rising like ghosts over dark valleys, rivers older than any empire sliding between the stones. Here, the Cherokee once told stories that memory itself seemed to carry in the soil. To them, rivers remembered, mountains held voices, and the ground beneath their feet was alive with the weight of ancestors. But what if those ancestors were not who we think? What if the Cherokee are the living proof of a chapter erased, a people who carry in their blood the echo of civilizations the world refuses to admit existed on this continent? You see, history is not written by truth, it is written by power, and power has always been a raid of what blood can reveal. The American government once invested millions into studying native genetics, not out of curiosity, but control. Officially, they said it was anthropology, genealogy, health. But beneath those reasons hid something darker. They wanted to trace, to catalogue, to decide who was authentic, who had the right to claim identity, land, and sovereignty. DNA became a weapon, a tool to define or erase. But sometimes the weapon turns on its wielder. In Cherokee DNA, researchers began to find lineages that did not align with Siberian origins, the tidy story that all Native Americans descended from a single migration over the Bering Land Bridge. Instead, some signatures suggested connections to ancient Europe. Others hinted at the Middle East. A few patterns seemed to belong nowhere on record, as if from a civilization the textbooks refused to name. This is not conspiracy. This is documented, but you will not hear professors speak of it. You will not see it on the news. Because to admit it is to unravel the foundation of what school children are told, that America began with Columbus, that the tribes were primitive, that nothing advanced existed before Europe's sails appeared on the horizon. If Cherokee DNA holds proof that others crossed oceans long before Columbus, if it carries the ghost of civilizations lost to time, then the entire myth of discovery, the entire excuse for conquest collapses, and with it, the power built upon that myth. Do you understand now why this is dangerous? This is not just a question of anthropology, it is a question of control. The elites who shape nations understand that blood is memory, and memory is power. If the Cherokee carry proof of forbidden history, then their very existence is a threat, not because they hold weapons, but because they hold knowledge, and knowledge can break empires. Think of it, every drop of blood as a ledger, every chromosome as a record that no court or government can erase. Unlike treaties that can be broken, unlike documents that can be burned, blood is incorruptible. It endures, which is why the cover-up exists, not to protect the Cherokee, but to protect the story that keeps the American empire standing. A story built on the lie of discovery, the lie of supremacy, the lie that history began when Europe wrote it down. I want you to feel the weight of this, because once you hear it, you cannot return to ignorance. You cannot go back to believing the polished lies of history books. You will know that in the blood of a people pushed to the margins lies evidence that America's true origins are far older, far stranger, and far more threatening to power than anyone dares admit. And that knowledge, If you choose to face it, changes you. It makes you dangerous too. So listen, in the ridges and rivers of the Appalachians, in the whispers of clan mothers and the ledgers of family names, in the very marrow of Cherokee descendants today, there exists a map hidden from the world, a genetic map that points not to one migration, but to many, not to one beginning, but to a network of forgotten worlds that collided on this soil long before the first colony was built. That truth is why history was rewritten. That truth is why science turns its face away. Because if you know that blood remembers, if you know that history is older and stranger than you were told, then you begin to ask other questions. Questions about who else is lying to you. Questions about what other truths lie buried in your own DNA, in your own ancestry. And once you start asking, you begin to wake up. And once you wake up, you are no longer the kind of man the system can control. This is the descent. The first step into a truth you were never supposed to hear. The Cherokee DNA cover-up is not just about one people. It is about the forbidden history of all people. And tonight, we begin opening that ledger. They came with clipboards and sterile vials, with polite questions and promises of heritage. They asked for saliva, for blood, for the scraps of memory kept in old family Bibles and faded church registries. They said they wanted to save a people's history, to map their origins, to trace their migrations. The Cherokee, exhausted by displacement and hungry for any tool that might prove their claims to land and law, cooperated. They handed over names, dates, places. They opened trunks and attics, and they gave what they could spare of themselves. But when science moved from study to verdict, the room for mercy closed. This is how empire learns to hide, not by force alone, but by bureaucracy. Papers are signed, appropriations are granted. Research committees convene under the respectable languages of anthropology and public health. Laboratories that once promised neutrality become theaters where politics and prestige play out. In the cool fluorescence of those labs, DNA does not lie, but human beings do. Results arrive in files stamped confidential, in memos that disappear, in footnotes that quietly retract the more radical claims. Listen, the controversy is not simply that unexpected lineages were found. The true alarm came when those lineages resisted tidy explanations. A few samples showed affinities not strictly consistent with a single overland migration. Some markers suggested contact with groups far removed in the map of orthodox history, not as an isolated curiosity, but threaded through families and clusters across valleys. For some scientists, that meant a new chapter in human movement. For institutions, it meant risk, because if people could show ancestry that predated or paralleled the accepted narrative, the moral foundation for conquest, the claim that these lands were discovered and thus available, began to erode. Power answers eroding foundations with two familiar tools: classification and erasure. Classification took the form of technical language, population substructure, genetic drift, sampling bias, terms that sound clinical, impartial, neutral. They let officials wave away inconvenient data as statistical noise. Erasure was more direct. Field notes misfiled, permissions revoked, press embargoes enforced. Grants were pulled. Young researchers with promising careers found their paths blocked. Senior academics, whose reputations tied them to established narratives, quietly advised caution. Publish later, publish smaller, do not speak in absolutes. The scientist who wanted to shout the implications from the mountaintops instead learned to whistle in the dark. Remember, too, how identity became currency. The government perfected systems that measured belonging with scalpel-like precision. Blood quantum rules, definitions of who counted as Indian, were formalized and weaponized. Suddenly, the shape of a person's ancestry mattered more than their lived history, their language, their rituals. DNA became a tool for inclusion or exclusion. Political power and federal recognition hinged on the right percentage on a certificate. In this climate, a genetic reading that suggested cross-continental threads could be used to disqualify, to delegitimize, to divide. If a family's markers could be shown as too mixed, their claims to certain rights might be compromised. What had been a search for truth became a battlefield for resources, sovereignty, and control. And in that battlefield, institutions do not simply ignore inconvenient facts. They co-opt them. Academic journals demand peer review. Funding agencies require a conservative consensus. The narrative that best preserves the status quo is rewarded with publication, grants, conferences, and headlines. The narrative that threatens it is left to gather dust on office shelves. The story of science as an objective seeker of truth dissolves when the incentives favor preservation over revelation. So the most uncomfortable findings often end up as footnotes, buried beneath layers of safer claims, or they are reframed as anomalies, exceptions that prove the rule rather than challenges to it. But erasure is never perfect. Memory, stubborn as a root through concrete, pushes back. Hidden ledgers and family Bibles became proof for those who would not be silenced. Church baptismal records, trader journals, and the sillery that Sequoyah gifted to his people, these artifacts held counter-narratives. They carried names that did not fit neatly into any one box, marriages that stitched together worlds, and oral traditions that refused to sterilize themselves for the convenience of a textbook. When combined with the patterns in blood, these fragments hinted at a different ledger, one of repeated contact, of migrations forgotten by polite history, and of a colonial story that had been edited to serve conquest. It's here that he cover-up gets personal. Imagine a grandmother with a faded marriage certificate in her hands, the ink smudged by decades of worry. She is asked to spit into a tube and told it will help preserve her people's genome. Months later, a letter arrives that uses her own blood to question her children's rights. A family that had always belonged to a valley now faces bureaucrats who speak of lineage uncertainty. This is not abstract. This is the way policy and science became instruments of social engineering. It is the way identity, which once belonged to memory and ceremony, was transferred into the custody of laboratories and legislation. And so the response within the Cherokee community became twofold: guarded cooperation and fierce reclamation. Some elders refused to participate. Suspicion had been honed into instinct by generations of betrayal. Others welcomed the chance to use every available tool to make claims the courts might accept. Tribal councils debated, sometimes bitterly, about how to engage with researchers. The paradox was cruel. The same technology that could validate rights could also be turned against them. In hushed meetings, legal advisors warned of precedent. In kitchens and porches, clan mothers spoke of the old ways and the danger of handing memory entirely to strangers. Meanwhile, those in power grew quieter as the evidence thickened. They changed the conversation. They framed questions about ancestry as academic, isolated, and ultimately inconsequential to the real tasks of governance. They emphasized assimilation narratives and the civilizing mission. They invited more responsible researchers to re-examine the data, and ever so slowly the radical edges of the argument were sanded down. But pressure creates fissures. Leaks happen. Young scientists, disgusted by the soft censorship, begin to talk. A discarded lab notebook surfaces. A long-forgotten grant proposal is discovered in an archive. Pieces of the puzzle show up in unexpected places. In private collections, in ancestry websites, in the murmur of tribal reunions, where relatives compare family stories and DNA test results. Each discovery fans the embers of outrage. Each fragment reclaimed from the archive is proof that the ledger is not closed. This is the middle ground of our descent. We are past the myth of gentle discovery, and we are beginning to see the machinery that kept the myth intact. We see how institutions reframed science into policy, and policy into tool. We see how blood, the one thing no power can truly erase, was both weapon and shield. And we see people, real people, whose lives were altered when private laboratories and public agencies made decisions about belonging without their consent. Keep listening. The next steps are darker, and they are closer than you think. We will follow the trail from the laboratories back to the ledgers, from tribal kitchens to Capitol corridors, and we will trace how an inconvenient truth became a silence so loud it echoed across generations. The ledger is not yet closed. It is only beginning to crack. To understand why the silence mattered, you must first understand what it concealed. The official record said that the Cherokee, like all indigenous nations of the southeast, were children of a singular migration across Gore. The Bering Strait, one beginning, one lineage, one destiny. That neat story fit the purposes of empire. A people with one origin could be displaced once, removed once, assimilated once, but the data whispered otherwise. In the helixes of blood, there were echoes not of one beginning, but of many, patterns that suggested older presence, unexpected kinships, threads tied to places that polite maps refused to name. If those whispers had been spoken aloud, they would have shattered the script of inevitability. For the doctrine of manifest destiny, built upon the idea that this continent was discovered and claimed by Europeans, rested on the fragile belief that no one else had rights prior to conquest. To acknowledge older parallel origins would have made dispossession not only immoral, but legally untenable. Courts, treaties, and land grabs were all secured by the scaffolding of a narrative. Change the narrative, and the scaffolding crumbles. So instead, the scaffolding was reinforced, reports were rewritten, datasets were trimmed. Samples that did not align with the preferred model were discarded as contaminated. When anomalies persisted, new labels were invented: outliers, admixed, statistical noise. These words, sterile as they sound, functioned like scalpels, excising truths before they could spread. Do not imagine this as a grand conspiracy with smoke-filled rooms and signed decrees. No, the cover-up was more mundane, and therefore more enduring. It was built from small decisions: a grant officer rejecting a risky proposal, an editor suggesting that a paper be more cautious, a professor advising a student to wait until tenure before publishing controversial findings. Each act seemed reasonable, even prudent, but together they formed a wall higher than any fort the colonists had ever built. Behind that wall, entire generations grew up with a version of history sterilized for consumption. School children were taught that native nations were once vast, but had vanished, save for the noble remnants who now lived as symbols of endurance. Museums displayed arrowheads and beadwork under glass, relics of a vanished race. In the background, laboratories kept their freezers stocked with samples, their shelves lined with forgotten ledgers, their silence unbroken. But silence, like pressure, creates fractures. Oral traditions, long dismissed as myth, refused to stay buried. Grandmothers told children stories of ancestors who met strangers from across the waters long before Columbus, stories that spoke of trade routes spanning oceans, of alliances forged and broken. Elders sang songs that mapped rivers differently than the government charts, songs that remembered migrations erased from textbooks. These were not stories for entertainment. They were ledgers of belonging, carefully preserved across centuries of exile. And then, in the late 20th century, came the spark no institution could foe. Early contain the democratization of DNA testing. What had once been the exclusive tool of federally funded labs began to trickle down to mail-order kits and ancestry services. Families who had been told their heritage was uncertain sent off swabs of saliva and received results that contradicted the official story. Some found markers linking them to unexpected places. Others found kinship with groups scattered across continents. What was once hidden in locked filing cabinets now arrived in emails, printable charts, colorful pie graphs. The reaction from institutions was swift but clumsy. They warned that consumer tests lacked precision, that results were prone to error, that only accredited research could be trusted. Yet the irony was sharp. The very institutions that had silenced inconvenient truths now demanded that their authority be respected. For communities already steeped in centuries of betrayal, such demands rang hollow. What followed was not a revolution, but a slow unraveling. In family reunions, in tribal meetings, in late-night kitchen conversations, people compared their results. They matched stories with science, weaving together a fabric stronger than either alone. The grandmother's tale of a marriage to a stranger with a foreign tongue found new resonance when her great-grandchild's DNA hinted at unexpected lineages. Oral history and genetic data became allies, not adversaries, and together they formed a counterledger, one immune to the silence of officialdom. And yet, even as truth seeped through the cracks, power adapted. Legal systems continued to wield blood quantum as a gatekeeping tool, reducing complex lineages to percentages. Tribes themselves, forced into impossible positions, sometimes adopted those measures to protect federal recognition and funding. The paradox deepened. To preserve sovereignty, nations had to play by the rules of those who had once sought their erasure. This paradox is the cruelest part of the ledger. A people asked to prove their existence on paper, in percentages, in charts, as if their songs and ceremonies were insufficient. A grandmother's lullaby, a child's first words in Cherokee, a river whose name carries centuries of memory. None of these counted in court. What counted was the number on a certificate, the sequence in a lab. Identity, once woven into the fabric of daily life, was extracted, quantified, and commodified. But ledger-keeping, no matter how precise, cannot capture the fullness of life. That is why memory resists, why oral traditions persist. The ledger of the colonizer was always incomplete, always biased toward dispossession. The ledger of the people is different. It is written in story and stone, in blood and ritual, in the very geography of the land. It records not just who belongs, but how belonging is lived. And now, with fragments of the suppressed data surfacing, with families reclaiming both their stories and their sequences, the two ledgers stand in tension. On one side, the official record, curated and controlled, designed to protect power. On the other, the lived ledger, messy and resilient, built from fragments that institutions tried to erase but could never fully destroy. This tension is where we stand now, in the present. A silence cracking, a ledger bleeding ink, a people reassembling themselves from the shards left behind. The question is not whether the truth will surface. It already has, in whispers, in fragments, in kitchens and courtrooms. The question is whether the institutions that built their power on silence can withstand the noise when it finally swells to a roar. Because make no mistake, the roar is coming. Each leaked note, each rediscovered ledger, each family that stitches story to sequence adds to the volume. And when the sound grows too loud to ignore, history myself will shift. The official narrative, carefully polished for centuries, will fracture. And from those fractures will rise a different story, not of disappearance, but of survival, not of vanishing, but of return. This is the reckoning, and it has only begun. The reckoning never arrives as thunder at first. It begins as a whisper, a quiet stirring in the archives where forgotten boxes of papers are dusted off and opened. In one such box, misfiled beneath a stack of agricultural reports from the 1940s, a graduate student finds a folder stamped "Preliminary Results, Restricted." Inside are charts, hand-drawn, that map Cherokee lineages against control groups from across the globe. The anomalies are there in black ink, affinities unexplained, connections denied. The student, startled, photographs the pages with a phone before the archive staff notices. Later that night, in a dorm room lit by a single lamp, those images are uploaded to a cloud drive and shared with a small circle of confidants. This is how cracks form. Not in the courts or the legislatures, but in dimly lit spaces where people who still believe in truth decide that silence is too costly. Some of these leaks come from idealistic students, others from aging researchers who no longer fear losing tenure. A few come from tribal employees themselves, people who have watched federal agencies use blood as both weapon and leash. The documents they recover are not sensational in isolation, but together they form a mosaic, one that exposes how the official ledger was doctored, redacted, and rewritten to suit colonial convenience. The Cherokee community, long accustomed to skepticism, greets these fragments with mixed feelings. Elders nod gravely, for they have always known the stories carried in song and memory. Middle-aged leaders weigh the risks. What will it mean for sovereignty cases in court? Will lawyers twist the data to undermine land claims? Will the government use it to redefine enrollment criteria once again? The younger generation, restless and unafraid, embraces the revelations. They form study groups, share files on encrypted apps, and cross-reference genetic findings with oral traditions. For them, the data is not frightening. It is confirmation of what their grandparents whispered when the lights were low. Meanwhile, the institutions that once orchestrated silence shift their strategies. Publicly, they ignore the leaks, dismissing them as misinterpretations. Privately, they scramble. Advisory boards convene to discuss damage control. Legal departments draft statements. University administrators caution faculty against speculative engagement. But the walls are already cracking. Information, once contained, now moves too fast for suppression. Each attempt at denial only fuels suspicion. Each condescending dismissal only sharpens outrage. Consider the case of the whistleblower in Raleigh, a mid-level archivist who had been ordered to shred a batch of outdated correspondence. Instead of following instructions, she tucked the letters into her bag and carried them home. Months later, those letters appeared in a blog maintained by an anonymous collective of Cherokee activists. The content was devastating, a 1960s exchange between a university anthropologist and a federal official explicitly discussing the need to minimize anomalous findings to avoid legal complications. The phrase itself, bureaucratic, bloodless, became a rallying cry. Minimize anomalous findings. In it, people saw the machinery of erasure laid bare. The collective that published the letters did more than expose. They reframed. They reminded their readers that this was not just a scientific dispute, but a continuation of the same colonial logic that once drove forced removals and allotment policies. What had changed was only the medium. Where soldiers once carried rifles, bureaucrats now carried clipboards and centrifuges. Where treaties were broken with ink, identities were broken with percentages. The continuity was chilling, and it lit a fire. Out of this fire came gatherings, not the staged hearings of government committees, but community circles held in school gyms, church basements, and outdoor amphitheaters. At these meetings, families brought both their oral histories and their DNA test results, laying them side by side like offerings. Maps were drawn on butcher paper, arrows tracing migrations not sanctioned by textbooks. Songs were sung in Cherokee, their rhythms reminding listeners that history lived not only in numbers, but in breath and heartbeat. In these spaces, the counter-ledger grew, not bound in leather, not archived under lock and key, but carried in memory, shared aloud, replicated until it could not be erased. Of course, power does not yield easily. As these movements gained visibility, pushback intensified. Some tribal leaders, fearing jeopardy to federal recognition, urged restraint. Federal officials warned that irresponsible interpretations of genetic data could lead to funding cuts. University departments quietly blacklisted outspoken researchers, ensuring that grants dried up and career prospects dimmed. Yet the more the establishment tightened its grip, the more the counterledger slipped through their fingers. For every door that closed, another opened. Online forums, underground publications, independent researchers collaborating across borders. One turning point came when a coalition of Cherokee youth organized a digital archive called The Ledger Lives. It was a sprawling repository, scanned documents from leaks, recordings of elders recounting migration stories, annotated DNA results voluntarily submitted by families. The project was not just about data, but about reclaiming authorship. No longer would others decide which findings mattered. No longer would anomalous mean disposable. Every fragment, every voice, every contradiction was preserved. The archive spread quickly, mirrored across servers to avoid takedowns. Journalists began citing it. Scholars outside the mainstream referenced it in footnotes, and slowly, the silence that had once shielded institutions became untenable. Still, the reckoning was not without pain. Families discovered lineages they had not expected, stories that unsettled rather than comforted. Some felt betrayed by institutions that had lied for generations. Others wrestled with the realization that identity was more complex than they had imagined. Old wounds reopened, and new divisions emerged, between those who wanted to use the findings for political leverage and those who feared that doing so would invite further manipulation. Yet even in the midst of turmoil, something remarkable unfolded: the return of agency. For the first time in centuries, Cherokee people were not merely subjects of research, but custodians of their own ledger. They could decide what to reveal, how to interpret, and whom to trust. The power dynamic had shifted, however subtly, away from institutions that once presumed ownership over Indigenous history. And in that shift lay the seeds of a larger transformation. If one suppressed ledger could surface, why not others? What if other nations, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw found their own fragments hidden in archives and labs. What if the very foundation of American history, polished for centuries, began to crack under the weight of suppressed truths? This is the danger the institutions fear most, not the exposure of a single anomaly, but the collapse of an entire narrative scaffold. Because once the ledger of silence is broken, the stories it tried to erase will not simply return. They will multiply, spread, and demand reckoning, and the reckoning, once begun, cannot be undone. Reckonings spread like wildfires. They do not remain contained within the boundaries drawn for them. What began in Cherokee kitchens and community halls soon crossed into the circles of other nations: Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, each with their own long memory of betrayal. For decades, whispers had circulated that the records held in federal repositories did not match the stories told by the grandmothers. Now, with Cherokee leaks surfacing in digital archives, those whispers hardened into suspicion, and suspicion into resolve. At a gathering in Oklahoma, a Muskogee elder stood before a crowd and lifted a bundle of yellowing pages tied with twine. They were land allotment records, he explained, inherited from his grandfather, a man forced to sign his name in English though he could not speak the tongue. The elder then produced a DNA test, printed on glossy paper, showing markers that contradicted the neat divisions written on those allotment pages. The room fell into silence. What else, the crowd wondered, had been buried beneath bureaucratic ink? Soon, delegations of neighboring nations began corresponding with Cherokee activists. Some shared their own documents, others offered testimonies recorded in elders' voices. Together, they formed what came to be called the Circle of Ledgers. It was not an official alliance, no charters, no bylaws. It was something older, a confederacy of memory, echoing the alliances that once resisted colonial conquest. This circle vowed that no new fragment would be allowed to vanish. Every note, every chart, every whispered story would be preserved and shared. The impact did not stay confined to native communities. Global research. Long marginalized for proposing alternative migration models, seized upon the leaks. Archaeologists from South America, who had found suspiciously early human settlements, began corresponding with Cherokee archivists. Geneticists from Polynesia, whose data hinted at ancient contact across oceans, uploaded their findings to the ledger lives. For the first time, scattered anomalies from across the world began to converge into a coherent challenge to orthodoxy. Institutions responded with fury. Federal agencies issued statements condemning unauthorized release of sensitive material. Universities threatened lawsuits against the whistleblowers. Social media platforms, pressured by quiet lobbying, began flagging certain posts as misinformation. But the effort to contain the spread backfired. Each attempt at suppression only confirmed what activists had been saying all along. The truth was dangerous because it was real. Meanwhile, the stories grew more personal. A Cherokee woman in her 20s, raised to believe her ancestry was too diluted to matter, shared her DNA results online. They showed connections not only to the Cherokee Nation but to groups across the Pacific. "I was told my blood wasn't enough," she wrote, "but my blood remembers." Her post went viral, sparking thousands of comments from Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike who had felt similarly erased by official definitions. Another story emerged from the archives of a small church in North Carolina. Hidden among baptismal records was a letter dated 1892, written by a missionary who described meeting families whose features and tongues seem older than the histories allow. The letter, long dismissed as eccentric, now took on new significance when compared with genetic anomalies. It was another fragment for the counter-ledger, another voice from the past refusing to be silenced. As these fragments multiplied, the political stakes sharpened. Tribal councils faced mounting pressure to decide how to use the information. Some argued it could strengthen land claims, undermining the legal fiction that indigenous nations were later rivals. Others feared it could backfire, giving the government ammunition to redraw enrollment rolls. Heated debates erupted in council chambers, in courtrooms, and on social media. The paradox deepened. To wield the truth was to risk further harm, but to ignore it was to continue the silence. In Washington, whispers of the reckoning reached congressional halls. a closed-door meeting of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs was convened to discuss the potential implications of anomalous genetic data. Staffers, wary of leaks, confiscated phones before the meeting began, yet within days, notes from the session appeared on activist websites. Among the most chilling lines, uncontrolled narratives may destabilize existing legal frameworks. That phrase, clinical, detached, revealed the fear at the heart of the establishment, that history, once untethered from its curated script, could unravel the legitimacy of the structures built upon it, and unravel it did. Journalists, emboldened by the grassroots momentum, began publishing long-form investigations. One exposé in a national magazine traced the path of suppressed Cherokee data from the labs of the 1960s to the archives of today, naming specific officials who had ordered anomalies buried. Another report revealed that private biotech companies had quietly acquired indigenous DNA samples through partnerships with universities, building lucrative ancestry databases while denying communities access to their own genetic heritage. Outrage grew. Lawsuits followed. But even as courts and legislatures became battlegrounds, the heart of the reckoning remained cultural. In Cherokee schools, teachers began weaving the new findings into lessons, not as settled fact, but as living inquiry. Students were told, here is what the official history says, here is what our elders remember, here is what the blood reveals. You must decide how to hold them together. For the first time, children were being raised to see history not as a closed book, but as a ledger still being written. Art, too, carried the reckoning. Painters began depicting double helixes interwoven with river patterns. Dancers choreographed performances where DNA strands became ribbons binding and unbinding across the stage. Poets wrote of the blood that remembers what silence forgot. These works traveled beyond Cherokee lands, displayed in galleries and festivals, reaching audiences who might never read a leaked memo, but who could feel the weight of suppressed history in their bones. And always behind the art, the politics, the science, there was the memory of removal, of boarding schools, of allotment, of treaties broken. The reckoning was not simply about DNA or archives. It was about the centuries of silence that had been enforced to keep conquest clean. What frightened institutions was not merely that the past was more complex than admitted, but that the very foundation of their legitimacy, the claim to rightful inheritance of land and power, was beginning to crack. Because if the Cherokee and their kin had deeper, older, more expansive origins than the official story allowed, then conquest had not just displaced a people, it had attempted to erase a civilization. And if that erasure could be proven, if the ledger of silence could be shown for what it was, a manipulation, a theft, then every deed, every treaty, every monument raised upon that lie stood vulnerable to challenge. This is what the elders meant when they warned, the ledger is not yet closed. The reckoning was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus, and its echoes were being heard far beyond the halls of power that had tried to contain it. The chorus spread outward, a sound that could not be reduced to an echo. What had begun in Cherokee kitchens now pulsed across the globe. Newspapers in Europe ran stories under headlines like DNA Data Challenges American Origin Myths. A university in Brazil held a conference linking the Cherokee anomalies with archaeological digs in the Amazon that suggested older and more complex civilizations than textbooks acknowledged. Polynesian scholars pointed out parallels between their oral traditions and the data surfacing in the Ledger Lives archive. What had once been an anomaly in a few blood samples had become a question pressing upon continents. Governments noticed. In Canada, officials scrambled to respond as First Nations activists drew direct parallels. If the US suppressed evidence of deeper origins, why would we believe Canada has told the full truth about ours? In New Zealand, Maori leaders cited Cherokee findings when challenging the colonial timelines still taught in schools. In Australia, Aboriginal ACEs activists launched campaigns demanding the release of state-held genetic data gathered during the 20th century under the guise of public health. The reckoning was no longer Cherokee alone. It had become a mirror in which other indigenous nations recognized their own suppressed stories. For universities, The pressure was relentless. Graduate students organized walkouts, demanding transparency in how Indigenous DNA samples were stored and used. Some institutions admitted, sheepishly, that they held thousands of samples collected decades ago without consent. Others doubled down, insisting on academic integrity while quietly tightening security around archives. But students were not deterred. They hacked into catalogs, leaked inventories online, exposed contracts between universities and biotech firms. Each revelation widened the crack in the wall, and biotech corporations, those silent giants profiting from the business of ancestry, found themselves in the crosshairs. Investigative journalists revealed that companies had built vast databases by purchasing or partnering with universities that had quietly banked Indigenous samples for decades. These databases, advertised to the public as tools for personal discovery, were in fact gold mines for pharmaceutical patents and military research. When Cherokee activists published documents showing that their people's blood had been sold in this way, outrage exploded. Lawsuits followed. Protesters camped outside corporate headquarters, holding signs that read, "Our blood is not your property." Amid the noise, the Cherokee community faced its deepest struggle yet: how to use the truth without letting it be stolen once more. In council meetings, debates stretched for hours. Some argued that the revelations must be weaponized legally, presented in courts to reclaim land and sovereignty. Others warned that to place the findings in the hands of colonial courts was to repeat the mistake of surrendering control. "The law will twist our blood against us," one elder cautioned. "It always has." Younger leaders countered that silence was no longer an option. "If we do not use this evidence," they said, "others will. Better that we tell our story ourselves than watch it distorted in someone else's mouth." The tension was fierce, the stakes immense. Could the truth be both shield and sword, or would every attempt to wield it invite new chains? This internal struggle mirrored one already etched into Cherokee history. Centuries earlier, leaders had faced the question of whether to adopt European writing, education, and law to protect their people. Sequoia's syllabary had been born in that crucible, a tool of survival, but also one that tethered Cherokee memory to the paper ledgers of colonizers. Now, once again, the nation stood at a crossroads: embrace the tools of science to reclaim history, or resist them to preserve autonomy. The people responded not with a single voice, but with many. Grassroots groups continued building the Ledger Lives archive, insisting that every fragment of story and data be freely available to Cherokee first, before any court or journalist. Tribal lawyers drafted both offensive and defensive strategies, preparing for lawsuits whether they chose to initiate them or not. Artists carried the reckoning into symbols and ceremonies, binding DNA strands into beadwork, weaving ancestral migrations into new dances. The struggle was no longer only about data, it was about authorship, about ensuring that history belonged to those who had lived it. And yet, the danger of co-option loomed large. Think tanks in Washington began circulating white papers suggesting that Indigenous claims rooted in genetic complexity were legally unworkable. Some even argued that if ancestry was too entangled to define clearly, then federal recognition itself should be reconsidered. The same institutions that had once silenced anomalies now attempted to weaponize them against sovereignty. It was an old tactic in new language, and the Cherokee recognized it for what it was. That recognition gave rise to a phrase repeated in speeches, songs, and social media posts: "We are not your data." It became a rallying cry, a shield against the temptation to let courts or corporations define the meaning of blood. To say "we are not your data" was to remind the world that identity was not reducible to percentages, not negotiable by grant committees or biotech investors. It was to insist that Cherokee memory, in story, song, ceremony, and land, was the only ledger that mattered. Still, reckoning is never tidy. Families discovered truths that unsettled them. Some realized their bloodlines were tied to migrations long denied, to alliances with peoples they had never considered kin. Others faced the painful knowledge that colonial violence had left its mark in their very DNA. Identity, once defined simply by belonging to a community, now shimmered with complexity. Yet even in confusion there was resilience. "We are many things," one elder told a gathering, But above all, we are still here. That is what matters. The cracks in the colonial ledger widened further when whistleblowers from inside biotech firms stepped forward. One, a data analyst, revealed that his company had intentionally buried findings that supported indigenous claims of ancient presence in North America. Another leaked contracts showing that defense contractors were exploring ways to use genetic data for surveillance of subpopulations. The revelations were explosive. Lawmakers demanded hearings. Protesters filled city streets. International human rights organizations condemned the exploitation of indigenous DNA. The reckoning had reached a point of no return. What began as suppressed anomalies in Cherokee blood had become a global movement demanding accountability from universities, corporations, and governments alike. And at its center, the Cherokee people themselves wrestled with the question that had haunted them for generations: how to protect truth without letting it be caged, how to wield memory without letting it be stolen. The ledger of silence was breaking apart. But what would rise in its place remained uncertain. A new ledger, authored by the people themselves, was being written in real time. In archives and art, in courtrooms and kitchens, it was messy, contradictory, alive. And perhaps that was the point. For a people who had survived centuries of erasure, to claim authorship of their own contradictions was itself an act of sovereignty. The silence had been shattered, the chorus had grown global, and yet the reckoning was only in its first movement. The storm broke in Washington first. Congressional hearings, framed publicly as inquiries into data ethics, quickly revealed themselves to be arenas where the suppressed weight of history collided with present power. Cherokee representatives, chosen by council consensus rather than federal invitation, entered the chamber, but not as supplicants, but as witnesses. They carried no lawyers, no binders of citations. Instead, they brought story and presence, beadwork adorned with spiraling patterns of DNA strands, songs that opened testimony, and a refusal to let their words be reduced to sound bites. The committee chair, wary of spectacle, tried to confine testimony to the scientific implications of anomalies in Cherokee DNA, but the witnesses resisted. They told of the boarding schools where children's hair had been cut and their blood drawn. They told of family members who discovered their samples locked in university vaults, sold and resold like property. They told of how every attempt to erase Cherokee memory had been justified in the name of science. The chamber fell silent. News networks, expecting a dry debate over genetics, found themselves broadcasting a trial of America's conscience. Millions tuned in. Clips of elders declaring "We are not your data" circulated online within hours, inspiring hashtags, art, and solidarity protests across the globe. Universities scrambled to issue statements. Corporations hired crisis managers, but the more institutions attempted to minimize, the louder the movement grew. Outside Washington, protests erupted at biotech headquarters. One in particular drew global attention. Thousands gathered outside a glass and steel tower in Boston, chanting as elders sang traditional songs into megaphones. Police lined the streets, but confrontation never turned violent. Instead, protesters carried placards painted with spirals, braiding DNA imagery with Cherokee syllabary. They refused to move for 3 days. On the 4th, a delegation of youth entered the building and delivered a single demand: return what you have taken. Meanwhile, the Cherokee Nation convened its own tribunal, not in the language of U.S. courts, but in ceremonial form. Beneath a canopy of oak and hickory, elders and youth assembled to hear testimony from those whose DNA had been stolen, catalogued, or exploited. Each voice was entered into the Ledger Lives archive, not as evidence for lawsuits, but as sacred record. The tribunal concluded not with judgment, but with a vow: our memory will not be caged again. That vow, live-streamed globally, resonated with indigenous nations worldwide. Maori elders sent messages of solidarity. Sami activists in Norway held vigils. In Brazil, indigenous leaders marched carrying banners with Cherokee syllabary alongside their own ancestral scripts. Governments abroad took notice. At the United Nations, a coalition of indigenous diplomats called for a binding declaration on genetic sovereignty. Their draft resolution demanded that no DNA of indigenous peoples be collected, stored, or studied without free, prior, and informed consent, not just legally, but culturally. For the first time, international law began to speak of ancestral molecules as kin rather than commodities. Back in the United States, the backlash brewed. Conservative think tanks argued that genetic sovereignty threatened national security, claiming that restrictions on DNA data would impede medical research and defense readiness. Some lawmakers floated bills that would classify genetic databases as critical infrastructure beyond the reach of community claims. Editorials in major newspapers dismissed indigenous protests as mythologizing science. Yet, the very ferocity of the backlash revealed how destabilizing the Cherokee revelations had become. Cherokee leaders responded not with counterattack, but with vision. They announced the creation of the Ancestral Futures Institute, a sovereign research body governed by Cherokee law. Its mission was to study Cherokee DNA on Cherokee terms, integrating scientific tools with oral traditions, ensuring that no finding left the community without consent. Young scientists, some trained in Ivy League laboratories, returned home to join. They carried laptops and pipettes into spaces where stories and songs had always lived. A new kind of science was being born, one in which data was not divorced from memory and discovery was inseparable from responsibility. The institute quickly became a symbol. Other indigenous nations announced similar projects: Maori genetics research collectives, Sami-led climate DNA studies, Amazonian biolabs woven into forest stewardship. Each asserted the principle that science could exist without empire, that knowledge could serve memory rather than erase it. International conferences once dominated by Western universities now found themselves reconfigured as gatherings where indigenous scientists spoke first, setting terms. But within Cherokee families, the reckoning remained personal and raw. Some households discovered genetic ties that unsettled long-held narratives. Families who had prided themselves on pure Cherokee ancestry now confronted evidence of African, European, or other indigenous lineages interwoven into their blood. For some, it was a wound. For others, a liberation. Around kitchen tables, debates unfolded. Was belonging determined by molecules, by story, or by the simple fact of standing with the people? Elders reminded them that Cherokee identity had always been more than blood. Adoption, alliance, and survival had bound families for centuries. The new data, they said, did not dissolve belonging but revealed how expansive it had always been. Our ancestors walked many roads, one grandmother told her grandchildren, and still they chose to be Cherokee. That choice is ours now. Youth carried that wisdom into activism. Social media bloomed with Cherokee voices reclaiming complexity. Hashtags like #MoreThanDNA and #LedgerOfLife trended globally. Art collectives projected spiraling DNA patterns onto the walls of federal courthouses at night, turning sterile facades into luminous testaments of resilience. Musicians sampled recordings of elders' tribunal testimonies into songs that pulsed across dance floors. The reckoning was not only a political battle, but a cultural renaissance. As the movement matured, a paradox sharpened. The more Cherokee people claimed authority over their DNA, the more outsiders clamored for access. Scholars requested collaboration, journalists begged for interviews, corporations dangled funding offers. The temptation to leverage global interest for resources was real, yet so too was the danger of repeating history, of letting others profit from Cherokee memory. The council responded by adopting what they called the Covenant of Breath, a declaration that no Cherokee knowledge, whether story or molecule, could be shared unless it first served the survival and dignity of the people. The covenant spread quickly, translated into dozens of indigenous languages, each community adapting it to their own traditions. It became a shield, a way to say yes or no without apology. By the end of that year, the world was no longer asking whether the Cherokee anomalies were real. That question had been eclipsed. The new question was one far more dangerous to the old order. Who owns memory? Who owns the future? Universities feared the answer. Corporations feared it more. Governments scrambled to contain it. But among the Cherokee, the answer was already clear. Memory was not property. and the future could not be legislated by those who had built their power on erasure. The reckoning had advanced from silence to testimony, from testimony to protest, from protest to creation. What came next would not be decided in laboratories or courtrooms alone. It would be decided in kitchens, in songs, in ceremonies, and in the unbroken choice of a people to remain authors of their own ledger. The storm had only just begun. The storm that had begun with whispers in DNA labs now spilled into the highest chambers of law and science. What universities once guarded as anomalies became evidence in international tribunals. What biotech corporations once hoarded as intellectual property became the subject of class action lawsuits filed not only by Cherokee citizens, but by a coalition of indigenous nations spanning continents. The reckoning was no longer contained. It was codifying itself into new structures, pressing against the frameworks that had defined global order for centuries. At The Hague, a tribunal convened under the banner of indigenous sovereignty and science. Delegates from across the world gathered, not as stakeholders, but as equal nations, demanding recognition of what they called the right of ancestral molecules. Cherokee representatives arrived with the covenant of breath inscribed in both syllabary and English, declaring that genetic material was kin, not commodity. The declaration startled diplomats who were accustomed to treaties about borders, trade, and weapons. Here, the subject was blood, memory, and the refusal to let identity be patented. Western governments attempted to stall. They argued that recognizing indigenous genetic sovereignty would paralyze medical research, undermine pharmaceutical innovation, and destabilize the biotech economy. Yet these arguments faltered when indigenous scientists themselves presented alternatives. A Cherokee biologist described how the Ancestral Futures Institute had developed treatments for diabetes, a disease devastating indigenous populations, without outsourcing samples or violating consent. A Maori delegation unveiled ecological models built from ancestral DNA that predicted climate resilience far more accurately than existing Western systems. The tribunal witnessed in real time that science could flourish without empire. The effect rippled outward. Universities, fearing lawsuits and reputational collapse, began to release inventories of their indigenous DNA archives. Some revealed they held tens of thousands of samples, many collected under coercion in the 20th century. The revelations were damning. Students and faculty occupied laboratories, demanding immediate repatriation. Protesters staged die-ins at biotech conferences, lying on the floor with labels taped to their arms reading Specimen number 117894 or Sample sold to Pharmacorp. The imagery was too raw to ignore. Pharmaceutical giants fought back. Lobbyists flooded legislatures with warnings that drug innovation would collapse under genetic sovereignty regimes. Stock prices wavered. Yet in an ironic twist, smaller biotech firms began pivoting toward partnerships with indigenous-led institutes, branding themselves as ethical collaborators. Investors, sensing where the future lay, followed the money. Within a year, the market itself began punishing companies that refused to adapt. Cherokee leaders noted the irony, but reminded their people that profit was never their goal. "Our survival is not a commodity," one elder told a press conference. "If others wish to profit from doing right, that is their affair. We will not sell our breath." In the United States, Congress faced unprecedented pressure. Hearings stretched late into the night as lawmakers debated whether to ratify a Genetic Sovereignty Act. Supporters framed it as long overdue justice. Opponents warned it would fracture the nation. The Cherokee delegation, invited to testify again, refused to be drawn into partisan theater. "We are not here to fit into your parties," one witness said. "We are here to remind you that the land beneath your feet remembers us." The act stalled in committee, but the cultural tide was irreversible. Across schools, students demanded curricula that acknowledged indigenous histories, not as footnotes but as central chapters. Museums returned remains and genetic samples en masse. Documentaries, novels, and art exhibitions carried the story of Cherokee anomalies into households far from Oklahoma or North Carolina. The reckoning had become cultural grammar. To deny it was to appear outdated, even complicit. Yet, the deepest transformations unfolded within Cherokee spirituality. As the community absorbed the scale of revelation, ceremonies began to shift. Fire circles incorporated songs that braided traditional chants with the language of DNA, not as reduction, but as renewal. Elders spoke of visions in which ancestral strands shimmered like rivers across the night sky, binding stars and blood alike. Youth reported dreams where molecules sang in syllabary, reminding them that science and spirit were never separate, but had only been divided by colonial frameworks. One powerful vision circulated widely. A medicine person described standing before a great spiral that reached from earth to sky. Each rung of the spiral was a generation, stretching backward and forward in time. The vision revealed that anomalies were not accidents, but reminders, markers left by ancestors to ensure the people would, one day, reclaim their ledger. "They hid songs in our blood," the vision said, "and now the songs are awakening." This spiritual renaissance did not erase divisions. Some Cherokees remained wary of integrating DNA into ceremony, fearing it risked sanctifying a colonial tool. Others argued that refusal itself was a form of captivity, granting too much power to empire by treating science as untouchable. The debate was fierce, yet it was also alive, proving that Cherokee sovereignty included the freedom to disagree, to wrestle openly with contradictions. Meanwhile, international scientists began flocking to Cherokee gatherings, seeking collaboration. Some came with humility, offering skills without demands. Others arrived with entitlement, assuming access to new data. The council enforced boundaries with clarity. Access was granted only when aligned with the covenant of breath, and always under Cherokee authority. Those who balked were dismissed. Those who stayed learned that collaboration meant listening as much as analyzing, sitting through ceremonies before touching a pipette, recognizing that molecules were kin. Slowly, the language of global science began to shift. Journals once dismissive of indigenous epistemologies now published articles co-authored with Cherokee scientists, treating oral history as data rather than anecdote. Conferences opened with land acknowledgements, not as empty ritual, but as binding statements of relationship. The concept of ancestral molecules entered mainstream discourse. Resistance remained fierce, but the grammar of science itself was changing. Back home, families continued their own reckonings. In kitchens and community halls, people traced family trees anew, weaving stories of migration and survival into the genetic strands revealed by the anomalies. Some found comfort in knowing their blood bore evidence of journeys across oceans and continents. Others wept at reminders of violence etched into their very cells. But across difference, one refrain persisted: "We are still here." That fact, undeniable and unbroken, became the foundation upon which all else stood. By the close of the decade, the Cherokee anomalies were no longer anomalies at all. They were truths too vast to be contained in footnotes or vaults. They had redrawn the maps of science, law, and spirituality. Yet for the Cherokee, the victory was not in recognition or reform. It was in authorship. The ability to tell their own story, on their own terms, without surrender. The reckoning had entered a new phase. The silence had been shattered, the storm unleashed. But what loomed ahead was more profound: the creation of a world in which memory could no longer be stolen, because it was guarded by those who breathed it into being every day. And in the words of an elder closing a council gathering, "The spiral does not end here. It carries us forward. The question is not whether the world will listen. The question is how we will sing." The spiral widened until it touched nearly every sphere of human life. What began as a Cherokee reckoning had grown into a global cultural renaissance. Universities in Europe redesigned anthropology courses under pressure from student unions, chanting, "We are not your data," in so. South America, indigenous-led schools flourished, teaching genetics alongside cosmology, insisting that one could not be understood without the other. In Africa, griots and scientists collaborated on archives where oral histories and DNA both traced migration routes. Across oceans, the suppressed voices of peoples, once treated as specimens, rose in harmony, shaping a new grammar of belonging. Art was the first frontier to change. Exhibitions in New York, Berlin, and Sao Paulo filled galleries with beadwork spirals, murals of DNA helixes transforming into rivers, and performances that fused electronica with drum and chant. Cherokee youth projected animations of the Ledger Lives archive onto skyscrapers, turning corporate facades into temporary canvases of survival. The effect was undeniable. What had once been dismissed as anomaly became aesthetic, cultural, and spiritual inspiration. Education followed. High school textbooks, once filled with neat timelines and Eurocentric discoveries, now carried chapters co-authored by Indigenous historians. Children learned that North America's story did not begin with Columbus, but with peoples whose blood, story, and song stretched back beyond measurement. In Cherokee classrooms, teachers wove the covenant of breath into daily lessons: respect for memory, refusal to commodify kin, and insistence on authorship. Students recited not pledges to nations but vows to their ancestors and descendants. Science, too, transformed. The Ancestral Futures Institute grew into a global hub, attracting scholars who were willing to work under Cherokee law. Research projects blossomed, not extractive, but collaborative. A climate study modeled weather patterns using both molecular archives and ceremonial calendars, predicting shifts with accuracy that stunned international agencies. A medical team, guided by traditional healers, developed new therapies for autoimmune diseases by recognizing balance rather than erasure as the body's goal. Slowly, reluctantly, mainstream journals adapted. The old dichotomy between Western science and indigenous knowledge eroded. Governments tried to adapt. Some passed laws enshrining genetic sovereignty, while others resisted, clinging to colonial frameworks. Yet the tide was cultural as much as legal. Politicians who dismissed indigenous claims found themselves unelectable in constituencies newly awakened to histories of theft. Nations that embraced indigenous leadership gained legitimacy on the global stage. The United Nations ratified the Declaration on Ancestral Molecules, citing Cherokee testimony as its catalyst. But the most profound changes unfolded not in institutions, but in homes, ceremonies, and dreams. Families gathered in kitchens to tell stories no textbook could hold. Elders taught children that identity was not a fraction or percentage, but a practice: to plant, to sing, to remember. Youth, once told that their future lay in assimilation, now imagined futures as scientists, artists, and leaders rooted in their people. Dreams brimmed with spirals, rivers, and songs awakening from blood. Cherokee spirituality deepened in ways outsiders could barely glimpse. Fire ceremonies grew larger, blending prayer with reflection on the journey from Ceylon. Sea to storm. Songs braided ancient syllables with words newly born of the reckoning: genome, molecule, anomaly. Yet none of these words felt foreign anymore. They had been reauthored, claimed, woven back into Cherokee memory. The people had taken what empire once wielded against them and remade it into ceremony. Tensions lingered, as they always do. Some worried that the flood of attention risked turning Cherokee's struggle into spectacle. Others feared that partnerships with universities and corporations, however cautious, might erode sovereignty again. But these fears were not signs of weakness. They were proof of vigilance. The Cherokee had learned that survival required not only resilience, but constant questioning, constant renewal. And so, as the spiral carried them forward, the Cherokee people held fast to one truth: their ledger was no longer written in someone else's hand. The silence had been shattered, the anomalies reclaimed, the blood remembered. The reckoning was not a conclusion, but a beginning. A child sits beside a river in Cherokee country. She is perhaps 7, her hair bound with red ribbon, her eyes tracing the way sunlight dances on water. In her lap rests a notebook filled with drawings, spirals, stars, strands that look like both molecules and songs. Her grandmother sits nearby, humming softly, telling stories of how their people reclaimed what was once taken. The child listens, then asks, "Grandmother, will they ever try to take it again?" The elder pauses, her gaze steady on the flowing river. "They may try. They always have. But remember, the songs are in us now. They live in our blood, in our stories, in the way we walk this land. No one can take what we choose to carry." The child nods, dipping her fingers into the water, watching ripples spiral outward. She whispers a word in syllabary, one she learned in school and in ceremony alike. Unoheda, unoheda, memory. The sound is soft but firm, carried by the current, joining the chorus that has spread across nations. And in that small act, the ledger continues, not of silence, but of life. The spiral does not end. It carries forward endlessly, in breath,